Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be digging into a pretty wild chapter of history, the sack of Rome in 1527. You sent over this incredible YouTube video with historian Alessandro Barbero and a whole panel of experts talking about it. It is seriously packed with intrigue. But we're not just going to run down the timeline of events. We're going to try to figure out why this event is still such a big deal 500 years later and what it tells us about power, religion, and Europe at like a major turning point.
It really is amazing how much this one event still captures people's imaginations, isn't it? I mean, the sack of Rome, it wasn't just some, brutal footnote in history. It really speaks to us about how precarious power is and how things were changing in European politics.
Exactly. Okay, so for anyone who's maybe not totally up to speed, the sack of Rome was basically the heart of the Catholic world being overrun and looted. Not exactly a shining moment for the Eternal City, right? And it was carried out by these mutinous troops under Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. But the thing is, to really wrap our heads around this whole event, we kind of need to understand the political scene in 16th century Europe, particularly in Italy.
Absolutely. So picture Italy in the early 1500s. You've got plague, economic hardship, and political instability. Everything's in upheaval. Basically, Italy became this battleground for two huge European powers, France and the Holy Roman Empire. And they're both fighting to control it.
So it's like Italy's stuck in this crazy tug of war between these two massive empires.
Exactly. And right in the middle of all this, you have Pope Clement VII. He's trying to navigate this super complicated and dangerous situation. He ends up trying to play both sides, making and breaking alliances with both Charles V and Francis I of France. And those two, by the way, they had their own rivalry going on, which has made everything even more messed up for the Pope.
Sounds like Clement VII had the worst seat in the house, honestly. So it's in all this chaos that we see the army responsible for the sack of Rome show up. This infamous group, the Landsknechts. What can you tell us about these guys? They sound pretty intimidating.
Well, the Landsknechts were German mercenary foot soldiers, known for being absolutely fierce and incredibly effective in battle. They were a force to be reckoned with, for sure. And their reputation, well, it definitely got around. But to understand what drove them during the sack of Rome, we got to think about what led up to it. These soldiers were dealing with unpaid wages, hardly any supplies, and this incredibly difficult march toward Rome. And all of that just made them even more volatile. And to make things even worse, their commander, Georg von Frundsberg, had a stroke and died on the way. Just added another level of chaos to the whole situation.
Oh, wow. So you've got this group of disgruntled, battle-hardened soldiers heading for Rome with no clear leader. Yikes. Okay, so let's talk about the, I guess, the elephant in the room, or maybe the Landsknecht in the room. How did the sack itself go down? I know it's a New York chapter in history, but it's important to understand what happened.
Yeah, it was truly horrific. The Landsknechts, they stormed Rome. They just overwhelmed the city's defenses. And then there was widespread violence, looting, and they even desecrated holy sites. To give you an idea of how bad it was, the video mentions that a lot of the city's defenders were actually thrown out of windows. The impact on Rome and its people was just devastating, and it lasted for a long time.
Wow, that's a chilling detail. The video actually makes a point of addressing this common misconception about the Landsknechts, that they were all devout Lutherans, driven by religious hatred for the Catholic Church.
That's right. While it's true that some Landsknechts probably had strong religious beliefs and resented how wealthy the church was, it's super important that we did just lump them all together. The main things driving the sack were their need to get paid, a desire for loot, and the general lawlessness that comes with war. There were even Spaniards and Italians among them.
It sounds like reducing their motivations to just one thing is way too simple then. But it does make you wonder, did this event, with all this violence against the papacy, did it help the Protestant Reformation gain momentum at all?
That's a really interesting question, for sure. It gets at the whole issue of cause and effect in history. I mean, from the point of view of the people who'd already joined the Protestant movement, the sack of Rome could easily look like some kind of divine punishment against a corrupt Catholic Church. It might have even emboldened the people who were questioning the Pope's authority.
Right. Okay, so now I'm really starting to see how this one event connects to so many different parts of European history. It's not just about the violence itself, it's about the impact it had on religion and politics.
You got it. And to understand how that impact played out, we need to look at how specific people navigated this crazy time. One really interesting character is Benvenuto Cellini. He was a famous artist and goldsmith, and he actually claimed that he personally killed Charles of Bourbon, the guy leading the attack during the siege of Rome.
Oh yeah, Benvenuto Cellini. The man who never met a story he couldn't make a little more exciting. I'm definitely hearing some healthy skepticism here.
Well, Cellini was known for his, let's say, creative way of telling stories. He loved to promote himself, so it's important to take his account with a grain of salt.
It's all about reading between the lines, right? Speaking of dramatic escapes, the video also describes Pope Clement VII's daring flight from Castel San Angelo. He disguised himself in a litter to escape the chaos. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does. It's a fascinating look at how chaotic and desperate things were at the time. And while the Pope was trying to save his own skin, other powerful families were playing a much more complicated game. The Farnese family, for example, they had people on both sides of the conflict, basically hedging their bets to make sure they survived no matter who won.
Wow, talk about a high-stakes balancing act. It really shows how complex the loyalties and alliances were during this period. So we've got power struggles, mercenaries going wild, a pope on the run. This is some seriously gripping history. But let's step back for a second and think about the bigger picture. Where does the sack of Rome fit into the broader context of Roman history? I mean, this wasn't the first time the city had been sacked, right?
You're absolutely right. The sack of Rome in 1527 wasn't an isolated incident. Rome had been sacked several times throughout its history. Remember the Gauls in 390 BC and the Visigoths in 410 AD. Each of those events left its mark on the city, adding another layer of trauma to its collective memory.
It's almost like Rome keeps having this recurring nightmare of being invaded and looted. But the interesting thing is, even after all these traumatic events, the city always seemed to bounce back.
That's the key point. The sack of 1527 had a huge impact on the papacy, the balance of power in Europe, and the psychology of Italy. But it's crucial to remember that Rome has this long and complex history of resilience and reinvention.
So it's not just about the destruction, but about the city's ability to adapt and rebuild even after facing such adversity. And that's something that still fascinates us even today.
Exactly, and it's that cycle of destruction and renewal that we're going to explore more in part 2 of our deep dive.
All right, so we were talking about Rome's its ability to bounce back after being knocked down. It seems like the city just couldn't catch a break. But this time, with the sack of 1527, things felt different, right? You mentioned that it had a big impact on the papacy. What exactly changed?
Well, you see, for the papacy, it wasn't just about fixing buildings and churches. It was a huge blow to their authority, their prestige. The SAG kind of showed everyone how vulnerable the church was, and it definitely helped the people who were already questioning the Pope's power. This feeling of disillusionment with the church, combined with the ongoing challenges from the reformers, well, it all added to the momentum of the Protestant Reformation.
Ah, so it's like the perfect storm. The church is already dealing with its own problems and criticism, and then bam, the heart of Catholicism gets sacked. It's easy to see how that would feed into the growing unrest, right?
Exactly. It gave reformers some serious ammunition. I mean, think about it. The symbolic center of Catholic power, trashed by soldiers, and many of them weren't even Catholic themselves. That's a powerful image, and it definitely resonated with those who saw the church as corrupt and in need of a serious overhaul.
It makes you wonder, how differently would things have gone if Rome hadn't been sacked? Could the papacy have survived the Reformation without this happening?
It's tough to say for sure, but it definitely added fuel to the fire. And don't forget, the sack of Rome also shifted the power balance between Charles V and Francis I, which had a big impact on the political landscape of Europe.
Right, so Charles V comes out on top. How did this event shape his reign and the relationships between European countries?
Charles V was already a powerful ruler, and this victory really cemented him as the dominant force in Europe. France, though, they were weakened, and that shift had long-lasting effects on international relations and conflicts for decades to come.
Okay, so we've got a weakened papacy and a shift in the balance of power in Europe. But what about the Italian people themselves? Earlier you said this event left a psychological scar. Can you talk more about that?
Just imagine living through that. It wasn't just about the physical destruction. The sack of Rome was a collective trauma for the Italians. It became a symbol of how vulnerable they were, how fragile their world was.
Yeah, like their sense of security was shattered. They saw the heart of their culture and faith being violated. No wonder it had such a lasting impact.
Exactly. It contributed to this feeling of decline and loss that you can see in Italian culture for centuries after. Artists, writers, thinkers, they all grappled with the meaning of this event. It shaped how they saw power, faith, and the fate of Italy itself.
That's a really powerful point. It wasn't just about rebuilding buildings, it was about rebuilding a sense of identity, a sense of place in the world. But like we talked about earlier, even in this chaos and despair, there were stories of resilience, like the Farnese family strategically maneuvering to survive. How did they manage to play both sides and come out ahead?
The Farnese family is a super interesting case study. They put family members in key positions on both sides of the conflict. They had cardinals loyal to the Pope and others allied with the emperor. Alessandro Farnese, who later became Pope Paul III, was even held hostage by the troops who sacked Rome.
Oh, wow. Talk about being caught in the middle of things. So by having to hand in everything, they basically guaranteed their survival, no matter who won. That's a pretty brilliant, if maybe a bit morally questionable, way to survive such a crazy time.
You said it. It just goes to show how complicated power and survival were during this era. You had to be flexible and sometimes ruthless to protect your family's interests. This was a time when loyalty could change as fast as the political winds.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that history isn't always black and white. It's full of gray areas, compromises, and people making tough choices in extreme situations. Speaking of extreme situations, we got to talk about Pope Clement VIII's escape, disguising himself in a litter to run from the Vatican. That sounds like something straight out of a Shakespeare play. What does that tell us?
Well, it shows how desperate Clement VII was, but also how resourceful. He was willing to do whatever it took to survive. His escape, even though it seems kind of funny looking back, it really says a lot about the danger he was in and the lengths he had to go to get away. It's a reminder that even the most powerful people aren't immune to the chaos and unpredictable nature of history.
You're right. Popes, kings, emperors, they're all human, right? They have the same fears and weaknesses as anyone else. It makes them seem more relatable somehow.
I think so, and it's these human stories, these moments of vulnerability and resilience that make history so interesting. It's not just about dates and battles. It's about people dealing with extraordinary events and the choices they make that end up shaping history.
Okay, let's go back to the Lansnicks for a minute. Earlier, we talked about how we shouldn't simplify their reasons for taking part in the sack. It's clear that it wasn't just religious zeal that motivated them. What else contributed to their actions?
Don't forget that the Lansnicks, while they were famous for being great hiders, were essentially soldiers for hire. They fought for whoever paid them. And when Charles V ran out of money, well, these soldiers were left high and dry, unpaid, and desperate.
So it's kind of like a deal gone bad. They were promised payment for their service, and when they didn't get it, they took matters into their own hands.
Exactly. And that shows how chaotic mercenary warfare was back then. Loyalty was a fluid thing, and when it came down to survival, anything went.
It reminds you that even in war, money matters. These soldiers were fighting to survive, and when that was threatened, they did what they had to do. And unfortunately, it was Rome that paid the price.
Yeah, the city was left devastated. The physical damage was huge, but the social and psychological scars were even deeper. The sack of Rome left behind destruction, disease, and a long, difficult road to recovery.
You mentioned earlier that the event had symbolic meaning. What did the sack of Rome represent to people back then, and how did it shape their view of the future?
The sack of Rome, it was more than just a military loss. It was a symbolic blow to the very heart of Christianity. It shattered this idea that the church was invincible, and it cast a long shadow over Europe's future. For many people, it felt like the end of an era, the end of a time of stability and certainty.
So if it felt like the end of one era, what did the start of the next one look like? What were the long-term effects of the sack of Rome?
It ushered in a period of uncertainty and change. It shifted the balance of power, intensified religious conflicts, and left a mark on Europe's cultural and political landscape that lasted for a long time. The effects of this event were felt for generations. It forced people to confront how fragile power is, how faith can change, and how unpredictable human behavior can be.
It's like this one event set off a chain reaction, and the consequences rippled outward for decades. It makes you realize how interconnected history really is. One event can have a domino effect, leading to changes no one could have predicted and shaping the course of future events.
That's exactly what makes studying history so fascinating. It's not just about memorizing names and dates, it's about understanding this complex web of cause and effect, the unintended consequences, and the ways in which the past still affects us today.
Speaking of understanding the past, we can't forget Benvenuto Cellini, the artist who loved a good story. We talked about him claiming to have killed Charles de Bourbon during the siege. Do you think there's any truth like that, or was it just another tall tale?
Cellini was a master storyteller. His autobiography is full of amazing anecdotes, but you gotta remember, he was a man of his time. Self-promotion and embellishment were common, especially for artists looking for patrons.
So it's like taking everything he says with a grain of salt, right? But even if we can't believe everything literally, it still gives us a glimpse into what a Renaissance artist was like, how they thought.
Absolutely. Even if they're exaggerated, Cellini's writings give us a valuable look into the cultural and artistic world of Renaissance Italy. They show us the ambitions, the rivalries, the anxieties of artists trying to make it in a world of patrons, politics, and artistic innovation.
And that's what makes history so interesting, right? It's not just about the big events and powerful people. It's about those individual stories, the personal triumphs and tragedies that really bring the past to life.
Exactly. And by exploring those individual stories, we get a much richer, more layered understanding of the broader historical context. For instance, even if Cellini's claims are questionable, the fact that he felt the need to embellish his role in the sack of Rome says a lot about how important the event was and how it stayed in people's memories.
It's like everyone wanted to be a part of history, even if they had to stretch the truth a bit. But even if we put Cellini's story aside, the video really emphasizes that Rome had been sacked multiple times before 1527. We talked about the Gauls and the Visigoths. What can we learn from these repeated events? Is there a pattern here?
There's definitely a pattern, and it's not just about Rome's strategic weaknesses or the ambitions of conquerors. It's something deeper, something symbolic. Each sack of Rome, no matter who did it, represented this major disruption of the established order. It was an attack on the idea of civilization itself. A stark reminder of how fragile human institutions are and how history seems to repeat itself.
So it's like a recurring nightmare, reminding us that even the greatest empires can crumble and be destroyed. But like you said before, Rome always seemed to bounce back. Is that just a testament to the city's resilience, or is that more to it?
Rome's resilience is definitely part of it, but it's also important to consider how these repeated traumas shaped the city's identity, its place in the world. Each sack forced Rome to confront its own mortality, to reevaluate its values, and ultimately to rebuild itself.
So it's not just about rebuilding physically, but also culturally and spiritually.
Precisely. Each sack, in a way, was a chance for reinvention. It forced the Romans to look at their past, deal with their losses, and imagine a new future for their city. And this cycle of destruction and renewal, even though it was painful, ultimately contributed to Rome's unique and lasting legacy.
That's a really fascinating way to look at it. It reframes these events as not just moments of devastation, but as catalysts for change and growth. It's almost like Rome's history is a testament to the human ability to adapt and overcome adversity.
Exactly. And it's that spirit, that ability to rise from the ashes that continues to inspire us today. The sack of Rome, even with its brutality, teaches us about the cyclical nature of history, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of hope and renewal.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. We've talked about the political maneuvering, the human cost, the long-term consequences, and those recurring themes of destruction and renewal. But I want to go back to one of the big questions we asked earlier. Did the sack of Rome actually help the Protestant Reformation?
It's complicated, but there's no doubt that the sack had a huge impact on religion in Europe. It really damaged the authority of the papacy, which helped those who were already pushing for reform.
So it's not a direct cause and effect, but more like the sack became this powerful symbol, something reformers could point to as proof that the church was corrupt and vulnerable.
Right. The image of Rome, the center of the Catholic world, being attacked by soldiers, many of them not even Catholic, was a powerful tool for Protestant reformers. They used it to show how worldly and corrupt the church had become, how far it had strayed from the teachings of Christ.
So while the Reformation was already in motion, the sack of Rome gave it a boost. It's a reminder that events in history don't happen in isolation. They're all connected in ways that can be hard to understand even centuries later.
That's what makes studying history so rewarding. It's like putting together a giant puzzle where each event, each individual story helps us see the bigger picture. And the sack of Rome, with all its complexities and contradictions, is a captivating piece of that puzzle.
Now, this video we've been discussing focuses mainly on the Italian perspective, but I'm curious, what do you think about how the sack of Rome was seen in other parts of Europe? Did it have the same impact in, say, England or France?
That's a great question. News of the sack of Rome spread through Europe like wildfire, and its impact was felt far beyond Italy. It wasn't just a local event, it was a shock to the whole continent.
I can imagine people talking about it everywhere, from royal courts to taverns, from London to Prague. But how did different people interpret it? Did they see it as a tragedy, a victory, or something else entirely?
The reactions were all over the place, just like the political and religious landscape of Europe. In Protestant areas, the sack was often seen as God's judgment on the Catholic Church, a sign that they were right to believe the papacy was corrupt and had lost its way.
So for them, it was like their beliefs were confirmed, a sign that they were on the right side of history.
Exactly. But for Catholic rulers and a lot of ordinary Catholics, the sack was a really troubling event. It made them worry about how vulnerable the church was, whether Christianity was stable, and if there would be even more chaos and conflict.
It sounds like everyone saw what they wanted to see, based on their own beliefs and biases.
That's a great way to put it. It just shows that how we interpret history is subjective. Even an event as seemingly clear-cut as the sack of Rome could be understood in different ways depending on who was telling the story and what perspective they were coming from.
It reminds us that there's no single objective truth when it comes to history. It's all about perspective. And the more perspectives we consider, the better we can understand the past.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to look at a variety of sources and interpretations. We need to listen to different voices, think about different viewpoints, and be open to challenging our own assumptions.
It's not just about learning the facts, it's about understanding the context, the motivations, all the complexities that make history so fascinating.
Exactly. And that's why the sack of Rome is such a great case study. It makes us think about big questions about power, faith, violence, and what it means to be human.
Okay, so to wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key things our listeners should remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the sack of Rome wasn't just some military victory or a violent attack. It was a symbolic event with consequences that affected all of Europe. It's a story about power, religion, ambition, and the fact that humans are capable of both incredible cruelty and remarkable resilience.
It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of old dates and names, but a tapestry woven from all these individual stories, motivations, and consequences. And like we've seen today, even something like the sack of Rome, which seems like a long time ago, can teach us a lot about human nature, the forces that shape our world, and the potential for both good and bad. But our deep dive isn't over yet. In part 3, we'll be looking at the final part of the video, where historian Alessandro Barbero offers some really interesting thoughts on the event's lasting legacy. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the sack of Rome. We've talked about everything from the political scene in 16th century Europe to the individual stories of people caught up in all the chaos. Now, I'm really interested to hear what historian Alessandro Barbero has to say about the lasting impact of this event. What stood out to you from his final thoughts in the video?
Well, Barbero does this really interesting thing. He compares the sack of Rome in 1527 to those two earlier sacks we talked about, the one by the Gauls in 390 BC and the one by the Visigoths in 410 AD.
Yeah, right. It's like Rome just kept getting invaded and plundered. But is he just pointing out that this happened a lot in Rome's history? I mean, what's the deeper meaning behind this comparison?
He's doing more than just pointing out a pattern. By bringing up those echoes from the past, Barbero is emphasizing how the sack of 1527 is part of this biggest story of trauma and upheaval in Roman history. He's saying that each sack, even though they happened centuries apart, represents this symbolic attack on power, civilization, and even the collective psyche of the Roman people.
So it's not just about the physical damage, but about those psychological scars that stick around long after the invaders are gone. Each sack adds another layer to this historical trauma, shaping the city's identity in a deep way.
Exactly. And the sack of 1527 happening right after the Renaissance, this period of amazing artistic and intellectual growth must have been especially devastating. It's like having this dream suddenly shattered, this stark realization that human achievement is fragile.
It's incredible how Rome keeps getting knocked down, but it always finds a way to get back up. What is it about the city that makes it so resilient?
Barbero talks about that resilient. He acknowledges all the trauma, but he emphasizes that Rome endures, it rebuilds, and ultimately it transforms itself. This cycle of destruction and renewal, as painful as it is woven into the very fabric of Rome's history. It's part of what makes the city so fascinating, so full of meaning.
That's a really interesting point. It makes you see these events not just as times of devastation, but as turning points, chances for reinvention and growth. Okay, so we've explored the historical background, the key figures, and the lasting effects of the sack of Rome. But let's bring it back to us, the people listening to this deep dive. Why should we care about something that happened 500 years ago? What makes this relevant to our lives today?
That's the big question, isn't it? Why look at the past? What can we learn from it? The sack of Rome, even though it was a long time ago, actually has some important lessons for us.
Oh, listening. What kind of lessons?
Well, first, it reminds us that power is never permanent. Empires, institutions, even individuals can reach incredible heights, but they can also fall just as fast. The sack of Rome is a cautionary tale about how fragile power is, how things can always change.
So it's a reminder from history to stay humble, to recognize that no matter how strong or influential you are, things can shift in an instant. There's always a chance of falling from grace.
Exactly. Second, the sack of Rome shows us how complicated the relationship between religion and politics can be. The event itself wasn't solely driven by religious fanaticism, but it had a huge impact on the Catholic Church, and you could argue that it helped the Protestant Reformation grow.
Right. It shows how religion can be a powerful force for both good and bad. And when it gets mixed up with politics, things can get really messy, really fast.
You got it. It's a reminder that religion and politics can really shape the course of history. The third lesson from the sack of Rome is that humans are capable of both incredible cruelty and remarkable resilience. We see this in the brutality of the invading forces, but also in the bravery and ingenuity of the people who defended the city and tried to rebuild afterward.
It's like a mini version of human nature, showing both our darkest impulses and our ability to overcome tough times. We can be incredibly destructive, but also compassionate and creative.
Precisely. And lastly, I think the sack of Rome reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of boring facts and dates. It's a living story, full of drama, intrigue, and lessons that still resonate with us today.
It's like looking into a mirror reflecting the past, seeing ourselves, our good qualities, and our flaws. By understanding history, we understand ourselves better, the things that shape our world, and the possibilities for the future.
I love that. And that leads us to Barbera's closing thought, which I found really thought-provoking. He asks, what if Charles V had managed to unite all of Europe under his rule? Would that have been a good thing or a bad thing?
Whoa, that's a huge question. It makes you think about the balance between unity and diversity, between strong central power and individual freedom.
Right. Knowing what we know now about the problems with empires and what happens when power goes unchecked, it's something worth thinking about. Would a unified Europe under Charles V have brought peace and prosperity, or would it have led to new conflicts and oppression?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it's those what-if questions that make history so interesting. They make us think critically, consider different perspectives, and wrestle with the complexities of the past.
And by doing that, we might understand the challenges and opportunities we face today a little bit better. After all, history isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future too.
Well, there you have it, folks. The Sack of Rome in 1527, a story of ambition, betrayal, brutality, and resilience. It's an event that still fascinates and challenges us, offering insights into human nature, the dynamics of power, and how the past continues to shape our present.
Remember, history isn't just a collection of old stories gathering dust. It's a living tapestry woven from the threads of human experience. And by exploring those threads, we gain a deeper understanding of who we are, where we came from, and maybe even where we're headed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exciting exploration of history, ideas, and the human experience. Until then, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.